Hello and welcome to TechWhirl's Fast 5 discussions, and thank you for joining us for today's show. Today we're talking about plain language and simplified technical English. We'll dive into the differences and the right time to use these approaches, and if there is also a moment where you shouldn't try to use these tools. Joining us today to help us understand both of them a little bit more is Dr. Erika Konrad of Northern Arizona University and NAU alumna and senior technical writer Karen Carroll. Also helping ask questions and keep my grammar in check is my longtime friend, business partner, and if you've written, edited, published hundreds of articles on technical communications and CXM, and have the most read website in the field, one heck of an influential person on those subjects, Connie Giordano.
Terrible.
My name's Al Martin, and I'm moderating and asking a few questions as well. So thank you all for joining us for today's chat. So Erika, welcome back. Yeah, it's been about a year since you all were hanging out with us before. How is everything going?
Oh, it's going great. In beautiful Flagstaff, Arizona, we have lovely fall color, and students are working hard.
Very nice. So what's the temperature right now? It's kind of warm everywhere, but where are you guys?
We're about 40 here in Flagstaff, 7,000 feet.
Oh, there you go. All right. Yeah, so we're actually warmer here. All right. So I have heard that you are working on a new class called Workplace Grammar. What be it about?
What be it about? Thanks, Al. Actually, I wondered a little bit about what you all thought when you heard that title for a class. If you just saw that in the catalog, what would you guess it's about? Or what would you like it to be about? If you're a technical writing master's degree student or certificate student, what would you like it to be about, or what do you think it's about?
Ooh, research. Connie, you wanna lead off on that one?
Do we want the smart Aleck answer or the?
Yeah, we love smart Alecks around here.
So I'm thinking it's how those tech writers who focus on things like, two spaces after a period, how they actually get along in the workplace, but
survival skills.
Survival skills for people who get very pedantic about grammar.
You can't
actually,
let it go.
I would think it would. I would think it probably has something to do with kind of the changing and changes of tone and voice and whatnot, how that impacts grammar when you're in the workplace versus dealing with other audiences. But
yeah,
I could be totally wrong about that. The other answer is more fun.
Oh, tell me that. Actually, both of those are true. I'm going to be covering a little bit at the beginning of just a review of grammar terminology, because I'm finding that a lot of my students have a lot of years between the time when they were studying grammar and when they're actually working on their master's degree or their certificate, and they want a refresher. Get that solid what's a noun and what's a verb, because when you look in resource books or if you're online looking at Grammar Girl, they talk about wonderful answers for people's actual workplace writing issues. But if you don't know what a noun is, or you don't know what a verb is, you're going to have a hard time understanding those answers. So that refresher is to help people just get a solid footing. And then we're going to cover things like what you just said. Is it really necessary for us to hold on to those two spaces after a period? Or can we lighten our grip a little bit when we get into the actual workplace? And what was the other thing you said that wasn't the smart Aleck? I really like the smart Aleck answer. What was the other part?
Oh, I don't remember. I kind of throw these things off, and 5 minutes later, I don't remember what I talked about. Well, just how our audience and the usage might impact how you use grammar in writing, in verbal communications, that sort of thing.
Right. We're going to look at a bunch of things that regarding exactly that. So how do you make these decisions? You've got the Chicago Manual of Style. You've maybe got an organizational style guide. When do you follow that exactly, and when do you vary? How do you bring your audience in to think about, well, what are they going to understand? What's going to affect them? How are they going to react? So making those kinds of decisions and bringing in all of those resources, knowing about your audience, knowing a style guide, and knowing things like, what does plain language tell us about what's clear? So bringing in all those things. We're going to touch a little bit about Simplified Technical English and plain language in the class, but we're going to be looking at a lot of workplace examples of making these kinds of choices.
Good.
Yeah, thanks, Connie.
It sounds like a great class.
Yeah.
Well, I hope so.
You have a special, like a special section with like your grammar, business speak, you know, strategical, give me a bell. That was my first goal, was we were going to teach kids the new language here to
leaning in, you know.
Yeah, we're going to run a lot of things up the flagpole, and
Hey, there you go. There you go. That's what we thought it was going to be about. Very cool.
That is going to be a really disruptive class.
yeah, I hope so. I welcome all smart Alecks.
Okay.
We're going to talk about passive.
For the record, I'm only this way. I'm only this way on these calls. Like I normally in class, I'm quite studious. So,
darn.
All right. Well, Karen, also, it's almost been a year since you hung out with us. We want to welcome you back. And
thank you.
So what I gather, though, is that this isn't the first time you and Erika have been talking about plain language and simplified technical English.
That's actually right. About a month ago, we presented a workshop to the STC Phoenix chapter about plain language and simplified technical English. We talked a lot about the differences between them, and then we each reviewed some basic principles of each. And there was about 15 people there. It was actually a really good way to spend a Saturday morning, I thought. I really enjoyed that.
Best question asked? Something you hadn't thought about?
You know, one woman mentioned that the engineers that she works with cling to the passive voice, and they have some very passionate views about using the passive voice versus the active voice. And so she asked that question when I was giving my presentation. So we talked about it, and what I wish I had asked her at the time, I didn't think to ask her this, was, does she know why they are so, married to the passive voice? Because some people like it because it kind of disguises who does what. The actor isn't very clear, and so it's appropriate for some genres, but I would say not for technical writing. So, so that was a really interesting question, and honestly, I didn't have I didn't have a way to really tell her how to fix that. We just kind of talked about how resistant they were to the active voice.
Well, it's much easier to say mistakes were made than it is to say I blew up the current code base,
Mistakes were made, others will be blamed, yes.
The code base was blown up, I think.
Yeah. But like I said, I forgot to ask her why she thinks they feel that way, but I think that would be a very interesting, if she could find a subtle way to do it, I think it'd be a very interesting project.
Indeed.
Unearthing that resistance. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. We look forward to asking you bunches of questions on this, and maybe we'll find the answer on that through Twitter or some of the questions that we've written or get submitted as well. Connie, finally, how's everything going?
Everything's going pretty well. We've gotten a few new writers on the site, and we just keep plugging along, publishing, you know, a new article every week or so, and lots of good response to a lot of them. People still argue on the discussion list, and now they're starting to argue on the community forums on the website, so it's all good.
Yeah. It's taken us 5 years to get some traction on our online forums. Yeah, no, that's awesome. I get to see those and moderate every once in a while. So. All right, so before we move into the questions, I want to take just a second. Northern Arizona University is one of TechWhirl's partners. If you are thinking about getting a professional writing certificate or taking a couple classes to better understand proposal writing, project management, document development, we really recommend you take a look at them. You can go to nau.edu. You can click on one of the ads that are on our website. Either way, or contact us, and we will certainly get you in connect. We will connect you with Erika and the team there at NAU, and you know, hope you all live happily ever after. But it's a gentle thought here. They've been a great partner of ours for a number of years, and have been a great source of answers to questions like we're going to have today. So into it. What's Fast 5 discussions? First, we have 5 big questions that we'll ask. We also have questions that are submitted when people signed up. Some good ones too. They're always good, but these were really quite sharp questions. As well as, if right now you're watching this and it is October 11th between noon and 1 Eastern time, and you want to ask a question, use the hashtag TWFast5, the one we always use for these. If you've seen them before, I will be checking Hootsuite and seeing if some of these come up, and those are the ones we will certainly answer first. So anyway, and if by some chance you missed this and you're watching it, go ahead and send us a contact through the contact form or something, and we will certainly pass your questions over and do our best to get those answered. So I guess probably nothing left to say except start asking the questions. Connie, do you want to lead off?
Oh, first, really basic question. What is the difference between plain language, sometimes referred to as PL, and simplified technical English, also known as STE? Erika, let's start with you.
Thanks, Connie. Yeah, the Simplified Technical English and Plain Language Guidelines are both specifications that help technical writers to write for their audience in a clear way. And the Simplified Technical English guidelines are actually rules. They are specifications for technical writers for how to write both procedures and descriptive pieces. So it consists of 2 parts. One is a dictionary of approved terms, and the other is a set of rules. And there are 52 of them. There used to be 65, but in the most recent iteration of the STE, there are now 52. And they come out with newly revised guidelines every 3 years. And they just came out with the new one in January of 17. So, for example, the STE dictionary tells you which words you can use and which words you can't, and which words you can use in one way but not in another. So, for example, as much as possible, STE specifications narrow down your choices so that you can use one word in one way and with one part of speech in any particular document. So, for example, the word test can be both a noun or a verb. So you can say, I took a test yesterday. So in that case, it's a noun. Or you can say, I tested the Jell-O. And in that case, the tested is a verb. So STE says, no, we're not going to allow you to use test in both of those ways. That can just be too confusing, especially for a non-native speaker of English. So the STE dictionary will tell you which of those parts of speech you can use. And if you can't use it, say, for example, test can be used as a noun, but it can't be used as a verb. So what do you use instead? You know, you want to say, I tested the Jell-O. What do you use instead? So the STE dictionary will tell you what words you can use. So also the STE dictionary helps you to figure out words that you can use for technical terms in your organization. So let's say you're in the aeronautics field, which is where STE started, and you want to use the word propeller, but the dictionary says you can't. Well, since that's a technical term in your field, you can declare it okay. So that's basically what STE guidelines are about. And Karen's going to tell you that they're really not guidelines, they're really rules, and that's the big difference. So go ahead, Karen.
Thank you, Erika. That's exactly what I'm about to say. When the STE is really rules-based, it's a yes and no, can and cannot set of standards, whereas plain language is a set of guidelines. And so when you think of guidelines, you think more of maybe wiggle room with certain principles in writing. So to that end, plain language there are many sets of guidelines for plain language on the web. So if you Googled like plain language file type PDF, you'd come up with several different documents that are put out by different government agencies. But Erika is correct. The real primary difference is that STE is very rules based, and it can be measured against one standard, and plain language is a set of guidelines that are very important, but that have room for the writer to apply to different situations. So, for example, take the passive voice. Well, you know, technical writers are always advised to use active voice whenever possible. Plain language guidelines say use it when it's, you know, use it as much as possible, but not when the subject is less important than the, I don't want to say this, passive voice makes something else the subject instead of the actor. And so it's okay to use passive voice when the thing you're talking about is not as important. So for example, you could say the document is sent to the printer, right? Well, that's passive voice, but it's more relevant to the user to say that than to say the printer prints the document, because we all know that a printer prints a document. So that's an example of a guideline, but to sum up, yes, it's exactly right. One is rules and one is recommendations.
Okay. I'm going to follow up real quick here. So are there organizations that propagate the rules of STE, or different organizations that come up with these guidelines? Who says what's an STE term that goes into that dictionary, for example?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Connie. The organization ASD, and I forget what it stands for, but it's a European organization started in Europe, and they are the ones that created the STE specifications, and there are actually representatives all over the world. So there's one here in the States that if you, Connie, want to make a change, you want to make a suggested change to the specifications, you can write to this person, and I believe he works for Boeing. Is that right, Karen?
In the U.S., he does, yes.
Yeah. So you write to him, and then he will bring that to the organization in Europe. So does that answer your question, Connie?
Sure, absolutely. Are there similar kinds of organizations that propagate the plain language guidelines?
There are. Because plain language really got its foothold in government writing because of the Plain Writing Act of 2010, these government agencies are now mandated to use plain language when they write for consumers of their information. Several government agencies put out their own sets of guidelines. So the federal plain language guidelines, for example, are put out by called plainlanguage.gov, and they support the federal government with implementing plain language in government agencies. And then there's other smaller agencies that have their own guidelines. right now there are really no guidelines written for technical communication, and that's one of the things I'm working on in my business, is developing a set of guidelines that would apply specifically to writing procedures and writing complex information or writing science information, and the things that right now the existing plain language guidelines don't address.
Gotcha. Okay. Very cool.
So before I dive into the next question we have sort of on the list, and we can research this. One of the things that will happen once we're done with this is we normally do a write-up and then we post this online. Are there software or websites that you can upload your document to, especially for the STE, sit in kind of like a grammar check or a spelling check just for regular approaches? Is there anything out there that will check for STE and kind of flag the words that have violated the rule?
Yeah, Al, thanks. That's a good question. There are software out there that you can use to do exactly that. The STE organization, the ASD, does, however, say that these are not official, that the software might not catch everything. So that's their disclaimer. You can go ahead and use those software packages, but they might not catch everything. So use it at your own risk and use it alongside your copy of the STE specs. So if you just Google STE software, you'll come up with a couple things.
Gotcha.
So,
okay. Yeah. It just seems, especially when it's rules based, and you know, if we're really drafting stuff, just seem like a reasonable thing that someone would be able to run algorithms against.
Yeah, and it's out there.
Okay, so let's get into our other question here. How can technical or professional writers take advantage of plain language guidelines in their workplace? Karen, do you want to take that one?
I do, thanks. That is a great question. It depends on how formally you want to implement plain language in your workplace, and given that change is difficult, under the best of circumstances, I actually recommend that if writers want to take on, bring plain language into their documentation, that they do make it somewhat of a formal process. So one of the ways I help companies with this is that I help them look at their existing documentation and then, over a period of time, bring plain language in. So some basic steps would be, first of all, have an independent assessment done of your documentation to see, where you're missing the mark and where your strengths are with your principles of writing clearly that you have in place now. And then that also reveals that some technical writers, not a lot of us, but some of us, really still struggle with some grammar basics and things like that, and that will identify those and help bring those writers up to kind of a master level of writing where we can apply plain language. And then the next step would be to start educating the internal culture about plain language. So your stakeholders, your managers, your engineers, anyone who's going to review the documentation and has a say in it needs to understand what plain language is, and then and this involves addressing a lot of the myths that come along with plain language. For example, people will say, well, plain language is just dumbing things down and we don't need to do that. Our users are smarter than that. And so that's something that writers have to address, is that no, it's really not. It's just making things as clearly as possible so they can be grasped on the first reading or on first listening, depending on the type of media you're using. And then from there, the department needs to, take a look at some existing guidelines that are out there and then start writing their own and customizing a style guide to their particular needs. And then, let's see, what would they do next? And then it's, it really just is a process. So once you have this guidelines in place, you can, I'm sorry, I'm hearing papers rustling. Is that?
That's me, I'm sorry.
Okay. So, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring up my document here. I got kind of distracted. So once you have your independent assessment done, you might want to ask for some training by the agency that reviewed your documentation to bring you up to speed. And then you develop the internal style guide, and you decide then how you will test your documentation. So there is no specific software that can help you test plain language, but you can ask users, for example, to read it and ask questions, and that'll tell you what's clear and what's not clear. And then once you start applying plain language to your documentation, you need to kind of reiterate the process where you update your style guide as you discover new areas that should use plain language, and have another assessment done, or do an internal assessment. And it really is a process, and especially when you hire new writers, you need to bring them up to speed. So that's what I recommend. I recommend that it's, if you're a lone writer, you can study up yourself and start applying it, and that's what I did when I was working for a corporation. But if you have a large department, you really need some structure and some guidance and some help to bring it in. Any little change will improve documentation, though. Any way you can apply plain language to your documentation will help your users.
Gotcha.
So by the same token, how would professional writers benefit from knowing the principles of STE, and how would they take advantage of it as they're doing their work, whether it's tech writing or other kinds of writing that they might be responsible for?
Thanks, Connie. The way that I have benefited from learning about Simplified Technical English shows up in the way that I respond to students when I look at their writing. I have found myself thinking more and more about, is this word that I'm using with my students, does it possibly have more than one meaning? Or does it possibly have the ability to be both a noun and a verb? So just reading a little bit of the dictionary has heightened my awareness. That's really how it's affected me. So it's not that I've memorized the dictionary, but I have in my head now, how is my reader going to respond to this? Are they going to get that this is a noun and not a verb? Or have I used it as both a noun and a verb in sentences right next to one another? Is that going to freak out my reader? So that's really how it's helped me.
Okay.
Gotcha. So what's another off-script question here? What's the penalty? Are there, or plain language, are there penalties here? Is this an aspirational item, especially for plain language, where we just know it's easier to digest, so we want to go that direction? It could be as much for branding. Are there times where certifications are granted, or approval in Europe? I know their documentation standards are a lot higher, often higher than in the U.S. Is there a stick against for either of these? I know the carrot, but is there anything like that available or around?
Well, Karen, you want to talk about plain language and the Plain Language Act?
Sure. Well, in terms of the way plain language kind of came into the workplace was through the Plain Writing Act of 2010, and that's when Congress ruled that consumers of government information deserve clear writing, right? And they were able to justify that law by the research they'd done, showing that when a document isn't clear, a user has to spend a lot more time understanding it. And that is what they call burden hours on the user. So the more time a user has to spend on a document, that increases the burden hours of the document, right? So that's how the government measures it. Now, in terms of business, statistics are harder to come by, but they are there. I've read that 63% of customer support calls come in because the documentation wasn't clear. So, for example, the information was in a document or a video tutorial or something, And because it just wasn't presented clearly, the customer still had to call customer support. So that's one way that we measure whether plain language is being used is are people calling customer support for things they should have found in the documentation. So there, as we move this more into the business world and, for example, software and technology, I think we'll see more and more research done on that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And Al, about the STE, I don't know if there's any legal ramifications to not using STE guidelines. I know that a lot of industries beyond the aeronautics industry use it, but I don't know if they're responding to legal regulations. So if somebody in the audience wants to pipe up with that, that would be great. I'd love to know that.
Okay. We'll check that out. Other research, I know you said plain language and calls, support calls. Other research that's out there that shows both of these are effective?
Yeah, Karen, can I take that one for
Absolutely.
now? Okay. Yeah, there's this interesting research that I found on the STE. It's a dissertation from 2007 out of Sweden by a person named Karen, and what's her last name? Durborg. And this research was done in Swedish export companies and looked at a couple things. First, the researcher did some interviews with the technical writers, and then the researcher looked at some non-STE writing and some STE writing and compared their readability. And what the researcher found was that, yes, the STE writing was more readable than the non-STE writing. And these were both procedures and descriptions. So it's a little bit harder to follow the STE regulations for writing descriptions, but at least in the opinion of the writers, the Swedish writers. So, and in that dissertation, they used the measure of readability was the Flesch reading scale, and that has its own issues, but definitely the numbers on that scale went up, which is a good thing with the Flesch readability, went up for the STE writing. In the interviews of the writers were all over the board in how long it took them to learn STE specs, and they also had different things to say about whether they liked it. So if you're interested, I could, Al, I could show you I could give a link to that dissertation, Connie, if people are really interested in taking a closer look at that. And for plain language, the UK is also on board, so to speak, with the plain language movement. They have their own government plain language websites, both in England and in Canada. And they did an interesting study on their passport application documentation. And in that study, at the beginning, when they were using their non-plain language passport application, 52% of applicants couldn't fill out the form the right way. So 52% were not able to figure out how to do this passport application. And after they revised it and made it plain English, which is what they call it in the UK rather than plain language, after they revised it to be plain English, 97% were able to fill out that form the right way. So what does this mean as far as, is this a good thing or just, oh yeah, of course? Well, if you look at the number of hours it took to fix those improper applications, it was 370,000 hours of administration time per year savings when they made this change. So yeah, it's a money saver, it's a person hour saver, and it saves frustration on the part of the user.
Certainly, yeah, that's a 300,000 hours.
Yeah.
Quite a set.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay. Oh, excuse me. So Karen, I'm going to direct this one back to you, particularly since your business tends to focus on this, and talk to us a little bit about some of the implementation factors organizations need to consider if they're looking at, fully adopting plain language or a simplified technical English.
Well, I think with plain language, they really need to, like I said, find out where they are. First of all, find out how clearly their documents are, and that would involve the independent assessment I mentioned earlier. And then once they have that, then they can look at whether they want training or if they feel like they're strong in certain areas and other areas. And then, of course, there's internal education, educating your stakeholders. And a big part of this is testing documentation. And unlike with STE, testing plain language or testing documents for plain language is actually much more subjective. So, the plain language guidelines that I've read say a document is plain or clear if the user can understand it. Well, that kind of sounds like circular reasoning, right? It's really not, because the key here is to do some usability testing with your document. So have some potential users read it, or even just someone in the company who's completely unfamiliar with the topic that you're writing about. And then find out what questions they ask you, like what was unclear to you, just say, did this make sense to you, yes or no? How could it be more clear, and what information does it not include that it should include? Something that I really love about the plain language guidelines is that they address not just the word choice. STE is very, very focused on word choice, and that's really, really important. But the plain language guidelines will also talk about document design, audience analysis. They'll look at how to structure paragraphs clearly, as well as sentences. And so I really enjoy working with plain language because it does kind of speak to the technical writer's whole everything we address every day, right? Is how well this information is laid out on the page or in the video. Whether we use headings frequently enough, and if they're descriptive, and the tone we use in procedures versus descriptive text. So those are some things to look at as you're thinking about implementing plain language in your program.
Kind of a related question would be, what kind of budget factors do you need to think about? I mean, obviously you've got, to have a training budget, but in terms of figuring out how you're going to do the testing or how much of your documentation you're going to do an assessment on, what are some things that you think about when you're preparing budgets for your clients?
The big cost, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. The big cost is really the training cost, and that the training is 2 to 4 days depending on where the department is. Excuse me, just a second. The frog is living in my throat right now. There we go. So that's the big cost, and then the independent assessment that can be actually very inexpensively done. I can do it with just looking at 2 pages of documents from different writers in a department, and it doesn't take me a lot of time. I write up a report, and then and it's not just an opportunity for me to pitch my training service. Obviously, this is something I'm very passionate about and I'm very committed to. So I then will customize my training programs to those particular writers' challenges. So we don't go over grammar basics if they don't need it, but we will if they do. So in terms of the cost factors, it really is just the training, the assessments, and it's kind of ironic or not ironic, because with plain language, it's all about guidelines, right? So it's a much more malleable process than it would be if you were implementing STE, because with STE you have the spec, you have the standard, you have the rules, and in plain language is much more flowing. It depends on, I guess the short answer to your question, Connie, is that it really depends on the writers, the group of writers and their needs, and how open their stakeholders are to bringing plain language into their work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Is there a complicating factor maybe in, I mean, I totally understand the idea of assessing, a sample set of documentation from each author that's on the team. What about the different types of documentation? Are some for user manuals versus regulatory warnings versus admin guides or configuration setups and those sorts of things? Does that factor into how you get an assessment of the use of plain language in the organization?
That is a great question, because yes, it absolutely does. I look at those different types of documentation you mentioned as kind of mini genres within within a larger genre of technical writing. So a user guide, for example, uses a lot of procedures. Well, with plain language, we have certain recommendations for procedures. Like, you use the imperative mood. When you're using steps, you use active voice. Whereas with like regulatory documentation, that has its own rules about what you call, for example, a warning versus a caution versus a note, for example. And then because it's regulatory text, it obviously has to be reviewed by legal, which is very, very important. When you're looking at like an API specification, plain language would say, minimize jargon. Well, with an API specification, jargon is perfectly okay as long as it's the jargon that the audience would use. For example, I wrote XML specifications in my last job for the credit reporting agency, and I used XML jargon because the developers I were writing for understood that. Jargon is an efficient form of communication for the right audience. So that's another thing about plain language that I really like. It is so dynamic in terms of its guidelines. It's appropriate to use jargon here, but not here, and that's something that training and an assessment would help writers understand. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
All right, so we had a few questions submitted to us while people were signing up, and the one, I believe, what are the reasons to think this type of language change would be useful in the marketplace? Just to check that one off, I think we talked a lot about the research there, the 300,000 hours, saving it, the reduced support calls. So I think we're good to go on that question. Here's one. We talked about high tech, hey, is there a plugin or something like that? But here's a different question on that, which is, what are some low tech tools for improving your simplified English in documents?
Yeah, okay, Al. Low tech, if you want to go really low tech, I think a dictionary would actually be a very helpful way to start. I don't know about all of you writers in the audience, but if you're like me, you love to actually read the dictionary. It's fun. I mean, you get to learn all kinds of new words, and you get to find out where they came from. And when you start to do that, you'll recognize, okay, this word, wow, it takes up 2 whole pages in the dictionary. It can be a noun, it can be a verb, it can be an adjective, and so a dictionary can be a very low-tech way to tune in to words that have more than one meaning and more than one part of speech, possibly. Another really low-tech tool is Microsoft Word. We're going up the scale on tech, though. To use, like you said, I think, Connie, was it you or Al who said, well, you can use the search function of Word, to find out whether you're using these words a lot, or to find them. You know, if you see in the STE dictionary, I'm not supposed to use test in this particular way, you can do a search on that word throughout your document and check each time, well, is this a noun or a verb, and then fix it. So that's another low-tech way. Another, going up the scale, plainlanguage.gov, is that the right address, Karen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so plainlanguage.gov has all kinds of resources that are free. So number one, the guidelines are totally free. And number two, there are training videos that are completely free. And there are a lot of ideas for how to use plain language in your organization that are completely free. So for example, how to write for the web for your organization. So tips on how to do that, they're totally free on plainlanguage.gov. So I recommend, if you're not familiar with the guidelines, if you don't know what they are, take a look. Totally free. They're nicely presented. They're written in plain language. What could be better? And for STE, the specs are free. Anybody can get the specs. All you have to do is go to the ASD website, and you click on a link through which you can request them. And I did that. I got a very friendly email from one of the people at the STE, and lo and behold, there was my free specs PDF. So that's also completely free. The training that I've seen, you have to pay for. And I don't know how much it is, but that you have to pay for. And as those writers in the dissertation I read about said, it takes some people longer than others to learn it. So there is a learning curve. And I think I don't know, have I gone up the scale in tech to where we're at mid-tech, or are we still in the low-tech category?
Virtual reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in the virtual reality training, so I think might be our next.
Oh, now that would be cool.
I'd like to add something.
VR STE. Got a question to follow up a little bit though. You mentioned, one of the first things you mentioned was reading the dictionary. What about the STE dictionary? Is that available anywhere?
Yes, that's part of the specs. Exactly. I'm really glad you asked that. Yeah, the STE dictionary is part of the specs. So you'll get all 52 rules and the wonderful dictionary. Yeah, so I recommend just reading that, just to get familiar with what words people have grappled with that they have come across as being somehow problematic. And some of them, in going through the dictionary, I recognized right away, oh yeah, that's a problematic word. And others, I was like, wow, I wonder why that's problematic. So I really wish that I had been in on the meetings over the years. It's fascinating stuff.
If I could add a little bit to what Erika said, all the tools she mentioned, the low-tech tools she mentioned, are excellent resources, and they're free. Another one I have to say is our brains, really. Once we really understand the principles of writing clearly, whether we're using STE or plain language, it becomes intuitive to us. So we can instantly read something we've written, and I know I've done this. I've been writing a document in what I thought was plain language, and then I go back a week later and I'm like, wait a minute, that's really wordy, that's not clear. So I think that, you know, just knowing the principles and kind of internalizing them makes you less dependent on any tools in the long run, because you just really get a grasp for what readers and users of documents will understand quickly, and what will challenge them a little bit more.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, can I follow up on that just a bit?
Sure.
Two of the rules for the Simplified Technical English specs are, number one, when you write procedures, use the imperative mood. So that is write using commands. So lift tab A, insert slot B. So don't say, could you please, or it would be a good idea to, because those things can be misconstrued or disobeyed. I'm thinking, oh, well, that's an option. So that's one of them. Use imperatives or commands when you're writing procedures. And the other thing is to include articles. Don't leave out a and the. So a lot of my students think that it's good to leave out a and the because when you leave those out, it's shorter. Your procedures are shorter, and it seems more tech languagey. But in reality, we need those articles. They can help our writing to be more precise, and they can help our readers to understand it better. So everybody out there, those are 2 of the 52 rules. So you now only have to know 50 more.
There you
Very
go.
nice. Our free service there, including this video.
Yeah, so now you can just get right on that then.
Yeah, that's right. And what we should do is we should then market a TechWhirl set of playing cards with the rule on one side.
That's
and
an
the
excellent
actual
idea.
That's it. We don't conferences anymore. We would do that as our swag. Connie,
I want to go to a party where we play this card game.
Yeah, well, you could, I mean, it would just be a
Drink.
normal deck of cards, so you could do gin rummy or whatever you wanted. But anyway.
I'm coming over, Connie.
Yeah. One more question that we got from some of the folks that registered was describing giving some information around how you would use simplified English for different target audiences. And I'm presuming it would probably mean something like, you know, how you use it with a developer audience versus the admin assistants in your organization who have to, you know, use the tool and schedule conferences or whatever.
Can I take that
and
one,
I'm not
Karen?
sure which one of you wants to take that.
Yeah, I think I like to use both. I like to use STE specs for some things and plain language guidelines for other things. And in a lot of cases, they overlap. So, for example, the passive voice issue, plain language covers that and STE specs cover that. So they both say use the active voice as much as possible. But you don't have to use it in situations in which it's actually helpful to use the passive voice. So like I said, a lot of these things in plain language and STE overlap. And then there are things that don't. So for example, if I want to use test as a verb with my admin associates document, I'm going to do that, especially if I'm writing a description rather than a procedure. But I would just be careful about, well, have I used this in a different way in the sentence that just came before it? And are there people in my audience who don't speak English as their first language? Then I'm going to really think about, wow, could they possibly use this, interpret this word in a different way than I intended? So I would use plain language as my overall goal. And then if I'm writing for an audience that might misconstrue my meaning, then I would be thinking more about those STE dictionary words. Is this possibly double meaning? Is this possibly double part of speech? Does that answer your question, Connie?
Yeah, I think well, I mean, it was actually a question from the audience, but it answered it for me. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
So I had a question, and it came out of, I remember working in England for a while, and I remember and doing grant proposals to the UK government. I remember the plain English movement that was mid 2000s, and I think they might have actually led off with the US coming up as well. But the difference between plain English directive versus the plain language directive in the US occurred to me, is that directive for English in the US? Is the directive also for, you know, making certain that, because we famously don't have an official language in the United States, predominantly English, but, you know, we have, what, 67 languages I think most docs are written in. Is there a movement also with Spanish and French and everything else to standardize that in a very similar way that we are with English?
Wow, that's a great question, Al.
Erika, I'll answer it and then I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
Look it up.
As far as I know, Al, there is not, but I do know that STE is written for, or is designed for use with people whose first language is not English. So with that, I'll turn the question over to Erika.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for reminding me of that. Yeah, the dissertation that I read was from Sweden. So these are folks whose first language is not English. So they're the writers whose first language is not English. So the writers and the readers. As far as a worldwide movement, I don't know. I know that the Académie Française has been around for a long time, and they regulate the use of French. But I don't know about Spanish. That's a really awesome question, and I'm going to have to, when we get done, or maybe I'll sneak and do it now, I'm going to have to Google that and see what the movement is. That's a really awesome question.
I just noted the difference, right, between the plain language law versus plain English for our friends in the UK. Well, we have about 5 minutes to go, so we're going to kind of start winding down, and we have exhausted. Let me check the Twitter one more time. For favorite info. Okay, so we did have Victoria here in the post-session write-up. Can you provide any links for favorite info on plain languages? So we certainly will, and make certain that we provide as many resources as we can as we're doing the write-up. So absolutely, that one's easy, and we will do it. If you think of some, or we find out more on the other languages, we'll certainly add those in there as well. But that's all of our questions. We want to thank, big thank you to our friends at NAU. We do recommend, if you are looking to kind of sharpen your skills, certainly take a look at their program and reach out via our website. Go directly to nau.edu, click on the link. You get to them, I'm certain that they will answer all of your questions. So also, Erika and Carol, thank you so much. You certainly helped us better understand both. I know that I had a cursory understanding, but certainly understand the differences, at least in being able to be conversational on it. So thank you both. We're certainly appreciate your time and yeah, the good discussion we've had today.
Thanks you so much for asking us.
And thank you, Connie.
All right, well, for Erika, Karen, Connie, myself, everyone at TechWhirl, thank you so much for watching. We hope you have a great day.